Today I am going to tell you the unique and unbelievable story of a prison break, in which the person who escaped was not some ordinary prisoner, but the world's biggest drug smuggler, El Chapo Guzmán. The Mexican police arrested El Chapo twice and sent him to prison, but both times he managed to escape, and whenever the police tried to arrest him from his safe houses, he always managed to escape through secret routes that no one had ever imagined. These prison breaks were planned and executed so perfectly that it clearly showed El Chapo was not just a dangerous drug smuggler, but also a clever and strategic criminal, famous for his brilliant planning. So how did the most powerful and dangerous drug smuggler of Mexico finally get caught, and how did he keep escaping from prisons and police again and again? This is an incredible and thrilling story. The story begins in Puente Grande prison, which was known as one of the most secure prisons in Mexico. The number of guards here was extremely high. In fact, every prisoner was watched by 2 guards. This was because the prison held Mexico's most dangerous criminals, most of whom were leaders of powerful drug smuggling gangs. These gang leaders were not ordinary criminals. They had entire armies armed with modern weapons. The authorities always feared that these gangs could attack the prison at any time. That's why the prison walls were reinforced with steel rods and built 1 meter thick. Guard towers and checkpoints were everywhere, making the place look like a military base. And this was the prison where the world's biggest drug smuggler, El Chapo, was locked up. El Chapo was the leader of the Sinaloa Cartel, the most powerful and dangerous cartel in the world. The cartel was involved in everything from smuggling drugs to murder. Because he was the leader, Mexican police had been hunting him for years. Finally, in 1993, they arrested him. But even in prison, El Chapo was so rich and powerful that he continued running his smuggling operation. He bribed every officer and guard in the prison, so heavily that he lived however he wanted. The warden even sent him alcohol, women, and his favorite food inside. Things got so extreme that both of his wives and even his mistress spent days with him inside the prison. From inside, El Chapo used phones to run his cartel business. The man who made all this possible was Damaso Lopez, the prison warden. El Chapo gave him so many bribes, money, a house, and even a car, that Damaso became his right-hand man. They became close friends. El Chapo not only ran his gang from inside but also figured out a way to smuggle drugs from within the prison itself. He called some of his cartel members for a meeting inside and told them they would dig tunnels under the prison to smuggle drugs. This idea was so unbelievable that no one would ever suspect it. His plan was to use these tunnels to smuggle drugs into the United States, because he knew that selling drugs in the American market would earn him unimaginable profit. He hired engineers and architects to build the tunnels professionally, giving them huge amounts of money and threatening to kill their families if they revealed anything. With this, the Sinaloa Cartel no longer needed ships, planes, or trucks to smuggle drugs. They were doing it directly from inside the prison. This had 2 advantages. First, they could smuggle drugs without fear of being caught. Second, they smuggled almost 4 times more than before. Through this underground smuggling network, El Chapo was making up to $20 million USD every month, which was unbelievable. His empire grew even faster while he was in prison than it did when he was outside. Since most of his drugs were smuggled into the United States, he was America's most wanted criminal. The U.S. repeatedly demanded Mexico hand him over, but at that time Mexico had a policy of not extraditing its criminals. So drug lords either used money and power to get released or escaped from prison. Despite America's repeated requests, Mexico refused to extradite him, so El Chapo continued living a luxurious life behind bars. Because his empire was thriving so well inside prison, he never even thought about escaping. 8 years passed like this, but in 2001 something happened that changed everything. The Mexican Supreme Court presented a proposal to create a law allowing Mexican criminals to be extradited to the U.S. When El Chapo learned about this, he panicked. He knew if he were sent to America, his comfortable life and drug empire would be destroyed, so he immediately began planning his escape. Within weeks, his plan was ready. He knew the fewer people involved, the better. So he gave a huge bribe to Damaso, the warden, who had become his closest ally. At first, Damaso was shocked, but the bribe was so large he agreed. El Chapo chose January 19, 2001 as the escape date. He told Damaso to reduce the number of guards in his section that day. Damaso didn't reduce the total number of guards in the prison, but quietly reassigned those guarding El Chapo's section to other areas. El Chapo also bribed a prison worker named Chito. Chito's job was to collect dirty laundry from the prisoners, load it into a cart, and take it to a van that transported the clothes to the laundry. Because this was his routine job, no guard ever suspected him. El Chapo selected him for the escape. Finally, the day came. On the afternoon of January 19, 2001, Chito opened El Chapo's cell. El Chapo climbed into the laundry cart, and Chito covered him with dirty clothes. Since there were fewer guards in that section, Chito easily walked the cart out. But just before reaching the gate, he saw a guard sitting nearby. To distract him, Chito left the cart and walked up to the guard, asking him to open the door. Meanwhile, because of El Chapo's weight, the cart started rolling backward on its own. From inside, El Chapo feared it would hit the wall and tip over, exposing. But just in time, Chito rushed back and caught the cart. He pushed it out through the gate and into the parking lot. A car was already waiting there. El Chapo climbed into the trunk. The driver was none other than a prison guard bribed by El Chapo. Since he was a guard, his car wasn't stopped or searched at the gate. And just like that, El Chapo escaped from prison for the first time. News of his escape spread quickly, but the police didn't rush to catch him because most of them were on his payroll. They intentionally delayed so he had more time to get away. But soon the federal police learned of the escape, and unlike the others, they couldn't be bribed easily. They immediately began searching. Meanwhile, El Chapo's men were waiting outside. They picked him up and drove him to another location where a helicopter was ready. He flew to a second place, where another car took him to a third safe house. From there he was moved again to a fourth location. They kept changing his position again and again so the police couldn't track. El Chapo's car was surrounded from all sides by police vehicles. Seeing this, he panicked and asked his driver how the police had found his location. The driver calmly told him that he had nothing to worry about, because all those police cars were actually there to protect him. They were corrupt officers, making sure no other police force could arrest him. Hearing this, El Chapo finally breathed a sigh of relief. These corrupt police officers stayed with him until he safely reached one of his cartel's secure safe houses. After El Chapo escaped from prison, the local people began to see him as a hero. Many even believed that he was above the government and untouchable. Meanwhile, the Mexican government used every possible resource and method to capture him, but they failed. For the next 14 years, El Chapo stayed out of the hands of law enforcement, while continuing to run his smuggling operations. During this time he kept moving from one safe house to another, and managed to smuggle billions of dollars worth of cocaine into the United States. This was the era when the Sinaloa Cartel became the largest supplier of drugs in the world. They became so rich and powerful, that they even surpassed Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel. But this power didn't come without bloodshed. Behind it were countless murders and brutal violence. The cartel created the most terror in Mexico's northern cities, right along the U.S. border. These cities were the main drug routes, and El Chapo eliminated all rival gangs there, declaring himself the king of the drug trade. Eventually, only one cartel controlled the flow of drugs between Mexico and the U.S., the Sinaloa Cartel. Because of the rise in drug supply in America and the growing violence in Mexico, both governments agreed that El Chapo had to be captured at any cost. They decided to run a joint operation together. 14 years after his first prison escape, in 2014, Mexican intelligence began working with U.S. intelligence. They tracked El Chapo's closest people, his sons, wives, and trusted associates, believing that these were the key to reaching him. Their guess turned out to be right. Among those under surveillance was El Chapo's technical assistant, a 20-year-old Colombian boy who handled his encrypted communication system. Mexican authorities arrested him, threatened him, and eventually convinced him to cooperate. Through him, the police gained access to the entire encrypted communication network used by El Chapo and his cartel. Once they had control of this network, they discovered that El Chapo was hiding in one of Sinaloa's safe houses. This particular safe house was not just a residence, but the cartel's headquarters, where all the major smuggling operations were planned. With this information, on February 17, 2014, Mexican Special Forces, along with the DEA, surrounded the house from all sides. But this was no ordinary house. It was built like a fortress. Behind the main door was a reinforced steel door. The Special Forces tried repeatedly to break it down. Inside, El Chapo was fast asleep, unaware of what was happening. Suddenly, one of his men rushed in and woke him up, nervously telling him that the Mexican Special Forces were right outside. El Chapo jumped out of bed and immediately heard the loud banging on the steel door. The Special Forces, hearing footsteps inside, hit the door harder and harder until it finally broke. Armed officers stormed inside, shouting for everyone to surrender. But to their shock, the house was completely empty. They searched every room and corner but found no one. The footsteps they had heard were real, but the people had vanished. The truth was that as soon as El Chapo was warned, he ran straight to the bathroom, but not to hide. Hidden under the bathtub was a tunnel, one of many that El Chapo and his cartel had built under all their safe houses. These tunnels were used both for escaping and for drug smuggling. The tunnel in this house was so well concealed that no one could even guess it was there unless they already knew. The bathtub was locked in place, and to open it you had to insert a pin into a small hole behind the bathroom mirror. That triggered an electric current that unlocked the bathtub. Once the lock opened, El Chapo lifted the tub, climbed down into the tunnel, and closed the entrance behind him. Because of this hidden escape route, the special forces wasted precious time. It never even crossed their minds that such a tunnel could exist. By the time they figured it out, El Chapo had already escaped with his wife and cartel members, disappearing far from their reach. After this escape, he decided not to stay in a safe house, which would draw suspicion. Instead, he went to a tourist city called Altiplano, believing no one would expect him to be there. But what El Chapo didn't know was that his communication network had already been hacked. He thought the raid on his safe house was just a coincidence, but in reality the authorities could now trace his every move. Only 5 days later, on February 22, 2014, Mexican special forces, working with U.S. agencies, tracked him down again. This time, El Chapo was staying at a hotel called Miramar. The forces quickly surrounded the hotel and captured him. Unlike before, this time he had no bodyguards and no corrupt police to protect him, because he never imagined that the authorities would track him so easily. After his second arrest, El Chapo was sent to Altiplano prison. This prison was considered escape-proof. It had more watchtowers than any other, with 3 guards in each tower, armed with assault rifles. The walls were lined with multiple layers of tall fencing, impossible to cut through. The prison even had its own secret army, ready to respond in case any drug cartel tried to attack. To make it even more secure, the Mexican government declared it a no-fly zone, meaning no aircraft was allowed to fly over it. Anti-aircraft weapons were also in place in case of an air assault. Inside, cell phone signals didn't work because of advanced jammers, so cartel leaders couldn't run their operations. Honest guards were hired who refused to take bribes. No prisoner had ever escaped from this fortress-like prison. But despite all these measures, El Chapo managed to do what no one else had ever done. He escaped from Altiplano too. From the moment he was locked up, El Chapo began planning his next escape. He knew he could be extradited to the U.S. at any time, so he was desperate to get out. Since phones didn't work inside, he had only 2 ways to communicate with the outside world: his lawyer Oscar Lopez and his third wife Emma Coronel, who were allowed to visit him. Through his wife, El Chapo passed secret messages to his 4 sons, who were leaders of different factions of the cartel. Outside, the man in charge was Damaso Lopez, the former prison warden, who had helped El Chapo escape the first time. After that, Damaso was fired and blacklisted, so El Chapo brought him into the cartel. Over the years, Damaso became his right-hand man, and eventually took control of the cartel when El Chapo was arrested again. Together with El Chapo's sons, Damaso began planning another escape. They all agreed that the only way was to build a tunnel, but unlike other escapes in history where prisoners dug tunnels from inside, this time the plan was to dig one from outside, all the way to El Chapo's cell. It was the first plan of its kind in prison break history. Their first challenge was finding a starting point. Altiplano prison was surrounded only by farmland, with no buildings nearby. After days of searching, they found a piece of land under construction about 1 El Chapo's sons bought it under a stranger's name, and work began. But another problem remained: how to pinpoint El Chapo's exact cell inside the prison. El Chapo had cameras watching him 24/7, except for one small blind spot, a wall in his cell behind which he bathed. He told his wife to pass along instructions to Damaso, that the tunnel should end exactly behind this wall. But how could they guarantee the tunnel would reach the right spot over such a long distance? At first, Damaso thought it was impossible, but then El Chapo came up with a brilliant idea that showed just how cunning he really was. His plan was to use the GPS tracker that was strapped to his ankle. If his wife could smuggle in a GPS device, he could send his exact location to the outside team. This way, the tunnel could be dug precisely to the right place. El Chapo placed the GPS watch behind the wall of his cell, and with that, Damaso and his men finally had his exact location. They began digging the tunnel in the right direction. As I mentioned earlier, El Chapo's people were experts at tunnel construction, and once again they built a professional-grade escape tunnel that looked like it had been designed by engineers. The entrance to the tunnel was made on the piece of land they had secretly purchased. Inside the tunnel, they reinforced the walls with wooden supports. After just 10 meters, it was clear that this was no ordinary tunnel. It was one of the most advanced prison break tunnels ever built. The gang laid a long ventilation pipe stretching almost a mile, powered by an air pump at the entrance so that the diggers could breathe easily while working non-stop. They also installed thousands of light bulbs throughout the tunnel, connected to an electricity generator, making it look like an underground passageway built by professionals. From the outside, the site looked like nothing more than an abandoned construction area, with crumbling walls and a roof, but inside, history's most sophisticated prison break tunnel was being dug. The cartel's workers managed to remove tons of dirt, ventilation pipes and all the construction material without anyone noticing. They even built a small railroad inside the tunnel, connecting trolleys to a motorcycle so they could haul dirt out quickly. Eventually, the same trolley system was used to smuggle El Chapo out. Finally, in June 2015, El Chapo's wife delivered him the message that the tunnel was complete. He chose July 4, 2015, as the date of his escape. He picked that day deliberately, Independence Day in the United States, because he wanted to embarrass America, to show that before Mexico could hand him over to them, he had already escaped. El Chapo hated the U.S. deeply, even though most of his fortune came from selling drugs there. His hatred came from the constant pressure America put on Mexico to extradite him. But just before July 4th, prison officials announced that a high-ranking officer would be visiting between July 2nd and July 6th. Security became even tighter, with constant checks of cells and inmates. Because of this, El Chapo delayed his escape by 1 week. On the night of July 11, 2015, after spending 16 months in Altiplano prison, El Chapo was ready. Surveillance cameras were watching him around the clock, so every detail of his escape was recorded. That evening, he was lying on his bed watching a comedy show on his tablet, the volume turned all the way up to cover the banging sounds his men were making as they opened the tunnel beneath the wall. Around 8:15, El Chapo slipped on his shoes, walked behind the wall where he used to shower, and vanished from the cameras. He climbed into the tunnel where his brother-in-law was waiting with the trolley system. El Chapo sat inside, and the trolley, connected to a motorcycle, sped him to the far end of the tunnel. When he emerged, a dirt bike with a small cart was already waiting. He got on and rode away, disappearing once again. The guards didn't realize he was missing until 40 minutes later. At first, they thought he was hiding behind the wall, but when they discovered the open tunnel entrance, they were stunned. Sirens blared throughout the prison, but it was too late. El Chapo was long gone. From the dirt bike, he was transferred into a truck, which was locked from all sides so no one could see inside. The truck drove for 2 hours before reaching San Juan. There, El Chapo gathered his essentials and boarded his private jet. To confuse authorities, another jet took off at the same time as a decoy. Meanwhile, his own jet safely carried him to a secure safe house, hidden in the mountains of Sinaloa. El Chapo's escape humiliated Mexican authorities. Just a year earlier, they had celebrated his capture as a major victory against drugs, only to be embarrassed again on live television. If he had stayed in his mountain hideout, he might have remained free. But he kept moving between cities and cartel headquarters to give smuggling orders, which made tracking him easier. With the help of American intelligence technology, Mexican authorities eventually tracked him to a house in Los Mochis, Sinaloa. They had been monitoring his associates, who often used the code word grandfather when speaking about him. Soon, they confirmed his voice over the phone, proving he was inside. On January 8, 2016, Mexican Special Forces and DEA agents surrounded the house. As they stormed inside, a heavy gunfight broke out. Most of El Chapo's men were wounded, but once again, he escaped through a hidden tunnel beneath a glass door. When he surfaced, he hijacked a car at gunpoint and tried to flee. But this time, the authorities had surrounded the entire area. Just an hour later, at a checkpoint 12 miles away, El Chapo was captured again along with one of his men. He tried to bribe the federal agents on the spot, but they refused. Furious, he cursed at them, but they photographed him and informed their commander that special forces were on the way. Knowing the cartel might launch an attack to rescue him, the agents hid with El Chapo in a hotel ready for battle. When vehicles approached, El Chapo smirked and told the agents they should have taken his offer, because now they would never see their families again. But his smile quickly turned into shock and fear. The vehicles were not his men, but a full army of special forces. The area was sealed off, and El Chapo was arrested for the third time. He was sent back to Altiplano prison, the same one he had escaped from, but this time 2 guards were stationed outside his cell 24/7. The Mexican government, exhausted and humiliated by his repeated breaks, finally decided to extradite him under treaty with the United States. In October 2016, the judge handling his extradition case was assassinated, showing how dangerous and powerful El Chapo still was. But eventually, in January 2017, guards entered his cell, handcuffed him, and moved him to a waiting helicopter. He was flown to an airport where a plane was ready. El Chapo didn't realize what was happening until the plane landed in New York. When DEA agents told him he was in the United States, the once untouchable drug lord broke down in tears. His trial in New York lasted years, with witnesses and evidence revealing the vast reach of his cartel. Finally, in 2019, El Chapo was sentenced to life in prison. Today, he is serving his sentence at ADX Florence in Colorado, the most secure prison in the U.S. Prisoners there spend 23 hours a day alone in their cells, with only 1 hour for basic hygiene. This was the story of Mexico's most dangerous drug smuggler, the man who made an entire nation tremble, who broke out of prison multiple times, and who managed to stay out of law enforcement's reach for nearly 50